The day my water bill jumped from $92 to $920, I figured the meter was broken. Vanessa Crowell, the president of our homeowners association, just laughed and said a man living alone had probably left a faucet running somewhere. She gave me 10 days to pay in full, or she would begin the process of placing a lien on my house. That night I walked outside and shut every valve I owned, and the meter kept spinning anyway, as if someone were pumping water straight through my backyard. I pulled out an old utility map my father had kept in a filing cabinet, traced a line that should not have existed anymore, and followed it to a spot behind Vanessa Crowell's house, where a valve cap had been buried under a bed of white decorative stone. I did not know it yet, but that little cap was about to unravel more than a year of stolen water. My name is Nolan Pierce, and I moved into Cedar Hollow after my father passed and left me the oldest house on the street. It sat lower than every other lot, tucked at the edge of a subdivision that had been built around it rather than for it, with pipes underneath that were older than half the families living above them. Cedar Hollow had 42 homes, and the association owned the master water meter for the whole community, then billed each house through a system of sub-meters it controlled completely. That meant nobody in the neighborhood ever saw a bill from the county. Every drop of water we used passed first through Vanessa's office, and every number on every invoice was one she had the power to shape. From the moment I arrived, Vanessa made her opinion of me clear. She criticized my truck for looking like a work vehicle, complained that my tools sat visible in the garage, and once told a neighbor that my house was a stain of masculine clutter on an otherwise well-managed community. During a yard inspection, she stood at the edge of my driveway and informed me that men who lived alone rarely kept a home to any real standard. I said nothing back, because I had learned a long time ago that a calm face makes some people angrier than an argument ever could, and Vanessa mistook my silence for weakness rather than patience. What she did not know, because I never told her, was that I had spent 12 years as a water loss investigator for a municipal utility system before my father got sick. I had walked hundreds of properties with acoustic listening devices pressed against curbside valve boxes, learning to separate the low hum of a healthy line from the telltale whistle of a slow leak eating through concrete somewhere out of sight. I had traced runaway bills back to collapsed clay pipes under decades-old foundations, back to backyard irrigation systems nobody remembered installing, and once back to a commercial car wash siphoning off a residential connection 2 blocks away. I had testified in front of county boards about pipe failures nobody else in the room could fully explain, standing at a podium with charts and flow logs, while men in suits nodded along to numbers I had spent weeks pulling together. After my father got sick, I left the full-time position and moved into private consulting on building performance, the kind of work that let me set my own schedule and be there for him during the long stretch of appointments and bad nights that followed. He died in the spring in the same house I was now living in, and there were still mornings I woke up expecting to hear him moving around the kitchen before I remembered he was not there anymore. I told myself the quiet of Cedar Hollow would be good for me, a place to rebuild something steady after losing him. To Vanessa, I was just a man who carried a wrench and drove an old truck with a dent in the tailgate. She had no idea I could read a water system the way other people read a room, following pressure and flow the way a doctor reads a pulse. There was one detail I noticed early on that I filed away without understanding it yet. While the county was posting notices asking residents to conserve during a dry summer, Vanessa's lawn stayed an impossible shade of green. Her pool never dropped below the tile line, and the little greenhouse behind her property ran humidifiers and misting lines around the clock. I mentioned it once to a neighbor, who shrugged and said Vanessa probably had a private well, though nobody in Cedar Hollow was permitted to drill one. I let the thought go for the moment, but it stayed lodged somewhere in the back of my mind, waiting for a reason to matter. That reason arrived with my water bill. My average monthly charge had been $92 for as long as I had lived there, steady enough that I barely looked at the invoice before paying it. The new statement claimed I had used more than 36,000 gallons in a single billing cycle, nearly 10 times my normal consumption, and on top of the base charge, Vanessa had tacked on an additional penalty she called an abnormal consumption fee. The letter warned that further penalties would follow if I did not correct the issue immediately, though it never once suggested what the issue might actually be. I spent the better part of a weekend checking every fixture in my house, the same careful sweep I used to perform for strangers who had no idea why their own bills had suddenly doubled or tripled overnight. I inspected the faucets, the toilets, the washing machine hoses, the irrigation lines, and every inch of exposed pipe in the crawl space beneath the floor, running a flashlight along old joints and listening for the faint hiss that would have told me something was actually wrong. There was no wet soil around the foundation, no drop in water pressure when I ran 2 fixtures at once, and no sound of running water inside the walls at night when the rest of the house was silent enough to hear the refrigerator cycle on and off. I even pulled the access panel behind the water heater and checked the shutoff valve for corrosion, thinking maybe something had failed quietly enough that I had simply missed it. Nothing in that house indicated I had used a single extra gallon, let alone enough to fill a small swimming pool 10 times over in the span of 1 month. If anything, the fixtures looked almost too clean, too ordinary, the kind of quiet house that should have produced a bill barely different from the one before it. I stood in my kitchen that evening with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, running through every leak scenario I had ever diagnosed professionally, and none of them matched what I was looking at. A leak that large, sustained for an entire billing cycle, should have left some trace somewhere on my property, and there was none to find. I wrote a formal letter asking the association to inspect the meter for a possible malfunction. Vanessa refused in writing, stating that the system had already been certified by a qualified technician and did not require further review. When I brought the issue up in person at the association office, in front of 2 board members, she smiled the kind of smile people use when they already know they have won, and said that men like me tended to blame the equipment before admitting they simply did not know how to run a household properly. She gave me exactly 10 days. If I did not pay the full $920 along with the added penalty, the association would begin lien proceedings against my property. I noticed something important in that meeting, that Vanessa either did not notice herself or did not care that I had caught. Not once did she offer to investigate the cause of the spike. She only wanted the money collected quickly, with the kind of urgency that made me wonder whether she had known this bill was coming before I ever opened the envelope. I paid the undisputed $92 that matched my normal usage, sent a certified letter disputing the remainder, and began keeping a written log of every conversation, every date, and every document that passed between us. That night I stood in my backyard staring at the little meter box near the curb, the one that had suddenly decided to report 10 times my normal life, and I made a decision. I was going to run the kind of test I used to run for the county, the kind that strips away every excuse and leaves only the truth of where the water was actually going. At 11 o'clock that night, I shut off every fixture in the house, disconnected the ice maker, closed the irrigation valve, and turned the main shutoff to my property fully closed, the same sequence I had run 100 times before for people who swore up and down that nothing in their homes could possibly explain a runaway bill. I photographed the meter reading with a timestamp on my phone, then walked back inside and waited in the dark kitchen, listening to the street go quiet the way it always did after 10. 15 minutes later, I walked back out with a flashlight, crouched beside the meter box, and watched the dial. It was still turning, slow and steady, the little red indicator sweeping around its face as though an entire house full of running taps sat behind it, when in reality every valve I owned was closed tight. I stayed out there for another hour, checking the reading every 15 minutes, and the number kept climbing the entire time. Water was not entering my home at all. It was moving somewhere else completely, through a branch that sat downstream of my meter but was somehow still tied directly to my account, billing me for gallons I had no possible way to use. I remember crouching there in the cold with my knees aching against the concrete, thinking that in 12 years of doing this work professionally, I had never once seen a meter behave this way on a property where every single valve was verified closed. I installed a small camera aimed at the meter box and began logging readings by the hour. The flow was strongest between roughly 1:30 and 4 in the morning. Then it would drop off sharply just before dawn, almost like clockwork. On the second night of watching, I heard a low engine hum drifting from the far end of the street, and a few minutes later a small tanker truck rolled out from the service lane behind Vanessa's property. Its side panel marked with the logo of Crowell Grounds and Floral, the landscaping company her brother owned. The next morning I asked the association to provide hourly consumption data instead of a single monthly total. Vanessa told me the system only recorded a final number at the end of each cycle, even though I happened to know that particular meter model was fully capable of storing an hourly flow history. She kept mocking the request in front of others, calling my investigation a technical tantrum thrown by a man who simply did not want to pay his bill. I did not correct her assumption about my background. Instead, I asked her to confirm, in writing, that the association was formally declining to inspect the meter. She signed that refusal without hesitation, confident it would be the end of the matter. I went back to the curb and worked the valves methodically, closing the line that fed into my house first, then testing the line downstream of my own meter. When I shut the inbound side, the meter kept turning. When I shut the line running out the other direction, past my property and toward the association's shared easement, the flow finally stopped completely. There was a second pipe tied in behind my meter, one that did not appear anywhere on the association's current site map, quietly routing water somewhere it was never supposed to go. I dug through my father's old paperwork and found a site plan from more than 20 years earlier, before Cedar Hollow had even finished construction. The original developer had planned a fire suppression reservoir on the highest point of the property, and to feed it, crews had run a 1.5-inch line from the main water tap near what later became my house, up toward the crest where the largest lots would eventually be built. The reservoir project was scrapped before construction finished, and the close-out inspection report specifically noted that the branch line had to be cut and capped before any homes were built above it. The end point of that abandoned line sat almost exactly where Vanessa's house now stood. I called Mason Bellamy, a licensed plumber who had spent years surveying utility lines for the county before going into private work, and asked him to come take a listen. Mason ran an acoustic sensor along the shared easement and confirmed there was active flow beneath the ground, even with every fixture inside my home switched off. We stayed strictly within my property and the shared utility corridor the whole time, careful not to give Vanessa any excuse to accuse us of trespassing. The signal traveled through the fence line behind my lot, under the shared walking path, and curved directly toward the back of Vanessa's estate. Mason noticed one section of pipe that had clearly been swapped out for newer material, which told us this was not simply an old line forgotten by accident. Someone had deliberately dug it up and reconnected it within the last several years. I requested the as-built drawings from the county records office, and they revealed that the association had filed for a project labeled a shared landscape irrigation upgrade a little over 14 months earlier. The signature approving that project on behalf of the Homeowners Association belonged to Vanessa Crowell. The contractor listed as the primary installer was Crowell Grounds and Floral, the very company owned by her brother Bryce. Mason and I marked the pipe's path with small survey flags as we traced it, and the final flag came to rest on a strip of common ground directly behind Vanessa's property line. Underneath a layer of white decorative stone sat a valve access cap, newer than the surrounding landscaping, deliberately concealed beneath a covering that looked purely ornamental to anyone who did not already know what they were searching for. I did not open the cap myself. I photographed its exact location, recorded the coordinates, noted the disturbed soil around it, and copied the manufacturer's stamp from the metal housing before backing away. That stamp indicated the box had been installed roughly 1 year earlier, matching the timeline of the association's so-called irrigation upgrade almost perfectly. Mason ran his listening device over the cap and confirmed it was not a single pipe underneath, but a splitter feeding 3 separate branches, each one heading in a different direction across Vanessa's property. The first branch curved toward her greenhouse, where the misting system and climate controls ran non-stop, regardless of the season, keeping tropical plants alive in a climate that had no business supporting them. The second cut across the yard toward her pool, and the automatic sprinkler network that kept her lawn a shade of green. Nothing else in Cedar Hollow could match during a drought, the kind of green that made neighbors joke she must have hired a secret gardener with a magic touch. The third ran to a service area behind the garage, precisely where Bryce's tanker trucks parked overnight under the excuse of routine plant maintenance, far enough from the street that nobody walking a dog after dark would think twice about the low hum of an idling engine. Mason knelt beside the box for a long time, tracing each branch with his fingers along the diagram he had sketched in a notebook, shaking his head slowly at the size of the fittings involved. He told me the kind of coupling used at that splitter was rated for far more volume than any single residential property could reasonably need, the sort of hardware he normally saw on commercial job sites rather than tucked behind a backyard flower bed. 3 branches, 3 separate purposes, and every gallon flowing through any of them was being billed, somehow, to an account that was not hers and never should have been. I set up a second camera on my own property, angled toward the shared access lane, and over the next 2 nights it captured 3 separate tanker trucks arriving after 1 in the morning. Each truck idled for roughly 20 minutes before pulling away, and every single time, my meter logged another spike of thousands of gallons. When I ran the math on the flow rate against the volume those trucks could realistically hold, it became clear this was not simply about keeping a greenhouse humid or a pool topped off. Bryce was using community water to fill tankers for commercial landscaping jobs that had nothing to do with Cedar Hollow at all, and Vanessa had turned my meter into the account that quietly absorbed the cost. When I went back to check on the survey flags a few days later, every single one had been pulled up and discarded. The white stone had been raked smooth again, arranged so carefully that no one would guess anyone had ever disturbed it. That same evening, Vanessa sent a formal notice fining me $2,500 for what she called unauthorized digging and interference with association utility infrastructure. In the same letter, she suggested I might have sabotaged my own meter deliberately, as some kind of scheme to avoid paying what I owed. The timing told me everything I needed to know. Vanessa understood exactly how close I had come to finding what was buried behind her house, and she was moving fast to bury my credibility right along with it. She sent a warning letter to every household in the neighborhood, careful never to use my name directly, describing an aggressive male homeowner who was allegedly sabotaging the water system and harassing a female board member. The language was chosen with precision, painting me as a threat rather than a man trying to understand an unexplainable bill. Several neighbors began treating me differently after that letter went out, crossing to the far side of the street or avoiding eye contact when I waved from my driveway. Vanessa called an emergency closed session disciplinary hearing, intending to add further fines and push through the lien on my house before I could bring in anyone from the county to inspect the situation independently. During the hearing, she interrupted me every time I tried to speak, reminding the room repeatedly that I was, in her words, a handyman with no business questioning a financial system she personally managed. At one point, she leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and told the two silent board members flanking her that men who carried a wrench for a living always seemed to think that made them qualified to understand spreadsheets and billing software. She said it lightly, almost as a joke, but there was nothing warm behind it, and I noticed neither board member laughed along with her the way they might have a few months earlier. I let her finish before I spoke again, because I had learned long ago that interrupting a person mid-insult only gives them a reason to repeat themselves louder. When I finally had the floor, I kept my voice level and asked whether the association had any technical basis for refusing an hourly data request, given that the meter hardware fully supported it. Vanessa waved the question away, calling it irrelevant procedural noise meant to distract from my own failure to pay a legitimate bill on time. I did not argue about my profession. I asked her 3 questions instead. Why had the association refused to release hourly meter data when the technology clearly supported it? Why had a landscaping project reactivated a branch line the county had ordered capped 2 decades earlier? And why did her brother's company trucks keep appearing at the exact hours my meter recorded its largest spikes? Vanessa never answered any of them directly. She declared the questions outside the scope of the meeting and pressed the board to move straight to a vote on my penalties. Dean Whitaker, the association treasurer, sat quietly through most of that meeting, but I noticed the color drain from his face when I mentioned the tanker trucks. Dean had signed off on financial documents for years without asking too many questions, and he was beginning to realize that his signature might soon be the one Vanessa pointed to when the truth finally surfaced. The night before the association planned to formally record the lien against my property, my camera caught an association maintenance vehicle pulling up to the access point behind Vanessa's house. 2 men opened the valve box and closed off one of the 3 branches, clearly trying to make part of the evidence disappear before any county inspector arrived. Vanessa was trying to erase the flow before anyone official could measure it for themselves. My camera had already recorded the timestamp, the vehicle, and both men working at the valve box in the dark. I copied the footage and sent it that same night to my attorney, to the county compliance office, and to every member of the homeowners board, making certain the association could no longer quietly bury this the way it had buried that pipe 2 decades earlier. Bethany Sloan reached out to me not long after the footage went around the neighborhood, catching me one evening while I was hosing dirt off my boots in the driveway. As a forensic accountant, she had grown suspicious of a mysterious water loss surcharge that kept appearing on her own statements without explanation, a charge small enough each month that most people would never bother questioning it. She told me she had almost let it go entirely, the way anyone might dismiss a few extra dollars buried in a long invoice, until she saw the notice Vanessa had circulated describing an aggressive homeowner sabotaging the water system, and something about the timing struck her as too convenient to ignore. Once I showed her my billing history laid out month by month, she went quiet for a long moment, then asked if she could borrow copies of everything I had. Over the following week, she went back through years of association records using her professional access to the community's shared financial portal and found at least 18 households that had been charged a nearly identical fee over the previous 14 months. Every one of those charges had been labeled the same vague way, buried deep in line items nobody ever thought to question, worded just generically enough to avoid drawing attention on any single statement while still adding up to a significant sum across the whole community. Meanwhile, Vanessa's own water bill told a very different story. Month after month, her statement showed a symbolic charge of just $1, with everything else, from the pool refills to the greenhouse misting system, classified under a line item called Community Landscape Maintenance. Dean quietly slipped me a copy of a contractor invoice describing an emergency irrigation bypass installation, a project that had never gone before the full board for approval the way association bylaws required. Vanessa had used her emergency spending authority to hand her brother's company a contract nobody else had ever seen or signed off on. Dean also still had an old email in which Vanessa instructed the maintenance staff not to add the new branch line to the master meter schematic and to temporarily log any unaccounted water loss against Lot 17, which was my address. She had described it at the time as a short-term fix while the system got rebalanced, a phrase Dean now realized had never been true for even a single billing cycle. For 14 straight months, that so-called temporary fix had quietly continued running water through my account while she filled her pool, ran her greenhouse, and supplied her brother's business for free. Once I saw that email, I finally understood that the $920 bill had never been a mistake at all. Vanessa had deliberately routed the largest share of stolen consumption onto my account because my house happened to be the only property in Cedar Hollow with a meter positioned upstream of the reactivated line. It was the perfect blind spot, an old house nobody paid attention to, owned by a man she had already decided was too simple to notice. The second layer of the scheme was even worse than the first, because she was not only stealing water for her own home, she was funding her family's private company with community funds and forcing her neighbors to cover the difference. Dean finally agreed to testify, but only if the association held an open meeting with a county representative present, so that whatever he said could not later be twisted or buried behind closed doors again. I formally requested that emergency session, determined to get everything in front of the community before Vanessa found a way to erase the records or shift every ounce of blame onto her own treasurer. There was no more room for private conversations or quiet threats. Everything that happened next was going to happen in front of witnesses who could not be intimidated into silence. Audrey Keene arrived at Cedar Hollow with a technician from the County Water Compliance Office, and Vanessa tried to block them from reaching the valve box behind her house, insisting the ground back there was private property. Audrey produced the utility easement documentation showing the box actually sat on association common ground, which gave the county full legal authority to inspect anything connected to the public water supply. Vanessa pivoted immediately, claiming I must have installed the pipe myself in some elaborate scheme to frame her. I did not argue with her out loud. I simply handed over the original site plan, the dated photographs, the hourly meter logs, and the contractor invoice bearing her own signature. The inspection team lifted the cap beneath the white stone and found the splitter exactly where Mason and I had marked it, missing any backflow prevention device and completely absent from every permit the county had on file. The absence of that safety device meant water from those landscaping tankers could potentially flow backward into the public system, and Audrey ordered an immediate stop to any further use of the connection. During a controlled test, the technician closed the branch running toward Vanessa's property, and my meter stopped turning almost instantly. He opened it again for only a few seconds, and the dial jumped forward exactly as it had every night for months. The entire test was filmed and signed off by multiple witnesses standing right there in the yard, leaving no room for anyone to claim later that the connection had been some kind of coincidence. They followed the pipe further and found it terminated at a hidden standpipe tucked behind a row of ornamental shrubs, fitted with a connector sized precisely for the tanker trucks belonging to Crowell Grounds and Floral. Two smaller lines branched off from there, one feeding directly into the greenhouse and the other into an automatic pool leveling system that kept Vanessa's water sparkling no matter how dry the season got. Every piece of infrastructure existed for one purpose: to keep her property lush and her brother's trucks full without either of them ever paying a fair share for it. Vanessa shifted her story again, insisting she had no idea about the technical details, and that Bryce must have installed everything on his own initiative. Audrey was not convinced, especially once she found a control panel for the pump system installed inside a utility closet attached to Vanessa's own garage. Dean provided an email in which Vanessa had specifically instructed the maintenance crew to run the pump only at night, citing a concern about lowering water pressure for residents during the day. That single line, written in her own words, proved beyond doubt that she had always known exactly what that pipe was doing. Audrey documented the unauthorized connection, the contamination risk it posed to the public system, and the unreported commercial use of residential water, then ordered the entire splitter sealed until the investigation reached a formal conclusion. Watching the county seal that valve box, I saw Vanessa's usual composure crack for the first time since I had known her. The technical discovery only proved where the water had been going. The meeting scheduled for that same evening was going to prove exactly who had been forcing everyone else to pay for it. Vanessa took her usual seat at the head of the boardroom table and tried to open the meeting by proposing a formal reprimand against me for damaging the association's reputation. I asked to speak before any vote took place, and though she initially refused, the other board members, having already read the county's preliminary report, were no longer willing to follow her lead the way they once had. I began with the $920 bill, showing a chart of my normal usage against the sudden spikes that always appeared between 1 and 4 in the morning. I followed that with the footage of Bryce's tanker trucks arriving at those exact hours, night after night, for months on end. Mason explained the structure of the buried pipe and confirmed that the reactivated branch had been rebuilt with new materials well within the past 2 years. Audrey read the county's findings aloud, describing an unauthorized connection feeding 3 separate destinations, all of them benefiting Vanessa's household or her brother's business, none of them ever disclosed to the community that was paying for it. Bethany presented her financial analysis, showing 18 separate households charged mysterious fees that existed for one purpose: to quietly cover the water disappearing from the master meter. Dean laid the contractor invoice, the internal emails, and the emergency spending authorization on the table in front of the entire board, every document carrying Vanessa's own signature. She tried one last time to belittle me in front of the room, saying I was simply a man who liked playing the expert because he knew how to hold a few tools. I answered calmly that the case no longer rested on anything I had personally said. It rested on the association's own meter data, the county's official survey records, the treasurer's documented paper trail, and the sworn conclusions of a compliance inspector whose authority had nothing to do with my background or my gender. The room went completely silent after that. Vanessa tried to turn the blame toward Dean and Bryce, but Dean immediately read the email where she had personally instructed staff to route the unaccounted water loss onto Lot 17. One board member moved to suspend Vanessa's access to every financial account the association controlled, and the motion passed 5-1 almost immediately, with only Vanessa herself voting against it. Moments later, a second motion removed her from the presidency altogether, and this time nobody hesitated before raising a hand. I placed one final letter on the table, the same written refusal she had signed months earlier, denying any need to inspect the meter and insisting the entire system was functioning with complete accuracy. That single signature proved she had known about the dispute from the very beginning and had chosen to keep collecting payment anyway, fully aware the numbers being sent to my house every month were false. A woman near the back of the room, one of the 18 households Bethany had identified, stood up before the vote closed and asked why nobody on the board had questioned a line item that appeared on her own statement for over a year without any explanation attached to it. Another resident, an older man who had lived in Cedar Hollow since before the subdivision was even finished, said he had once asked Vanessa directly why his bill kept climbing and had been told, almost exactly the way she had told me, that he simply needed to manage his household better. Hearing that phrase repeated back by someone else in the room seemed to be the moment several board members finally understood how consistent and how deliberate her pattern had been. Audrey stayed through the entire vote, taking notes for the county file, and when she finally spoke again, she reminded the board that the compliance office would be following up separately regarding the unauthorized connection and the unreported commercial use of a residential account. Vanessa tried once more to frame the entire situation as a misunderstanding between neighbors, insisting that whatever mistakes had happened were administrative rather than intentional. Nobody in the room appeared to believe her anymore, and the silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. The lien against my house was withdrawn on the spot, right there in front of the same neighbors who had once avoided my eyes on the street. Vanessa walked out of that meeting in silence, passing rows of residents who had unknowingly been paying for her pool, her greenhouse, and her brother's landscaping trucks for well over a year. Nobody spoke to her on the way out, and nobody needed to. The numbers had already said everything that mattered. The association brought in an independent auditing firm to review every account from the previous 2 years, poring over invoices, bank statements, and maintenance logs that Vanessa had never expected anyone outside her own office to examine so closely. Their findings confirmed that Vanessa had concealed water loss, misallocated costs across dozens of households, and awarded a contract to a family member's company without ever disclosing the obvious conflict of interest to the rest of the board. The final report ran to nearly 40 pages, and even Dean, who had lived with these numbers for years, admitted he was startled by how much had been moving beneath the surface without his full understanding. Bryce was ordered to repay the cost of every gallon his trucks had taken, along with a share of the expense for installing the unauthorized pipeline in the first place, a total that came to a significant sum once the auditors finished their calculations. His landscaping contracts outside the neighborhood came under scrutiny as well, since several clients had been billed for water service that, as it turned out, Crowell Grounds and Floral had never actually paid for itself. He quietly lost 2 of his largest accounts once word began to spread through the wider business community about how his water had really been sourced. Vanessa resigned from the board within the week, and a community vote soon after formally removed her from any remaining position of authority within the association. The county did not pursue immediate criminal charges, but it forwarded the entire financial record to the appropriate oversight agency for further review of possible fraud and unauthorized use of a public water connection. Every fine that had ever been levied against me was reversed, and I received a full refund covering the disputed charges, the plumbing inspection costs, my legal fees, and compensation for the months my property had been used without my knowledge. The 18 other households that Bethany had identified were reimbursed for the mysterious water loss fees they had been charged over more than a year. Under direct county supervision, crews dug up the pipeline behind what used to be Vanessa's house, removed the 3-way splitter, and finally cut and sealed the old line the way the original closeout report had required 2 decades earlier. The board offered me the presidency once the dust settled, and I turned it down. Because replacing one person who controlled everything with another person who controlled everything was never the point of any of this. Instead, I agreed to join a newly formed Utilities Oversight Committee, one built specifically so that every future billing decision, every contractor selection, and every technical change to the water system would be made openly, in front of the residents who actually paid for it. We set up a simple rule that any variance larger than 10% from a household's average usage had to trigger an automatic notice and an offer of inspection, the exact safeguard that should have existed the day I moved into Cedar Hollow. Bethany joined the committee as well, reviewing the books each quarter and posting a plain summary for anyone who wanted to read it, something the association had never done in all the years Vanessa ran it. Dean kept his position as treasurer, though he seemed lighter somehow, once the truth was finally out in the open, no longer carrying the weight of signatures he had never fully understood the meaning of. Mason still comes by every few months to check the old fire suppression line where it was capped, just to be sure nothing has been quietly reopened in the dark. A few months later, my new water bill arrived showing $94, a number close enough to normal that I barely needed to check it twice before setting it on the kitchen counter with the rest of the mail. I carried that bill out to the curb the same afternoon I happened to see Vanessa standing beside her pool, the water level dropping steadily now that the automatic system feeding it had finally been shut off for good. The greenhouse behind her house sat dark and empty, its misting lines disconnected, the plants inside already beginning to wilt, without a private water source to keep them alive artificially. Bryce's trucks no longer parked in the service lane at night, and the neighborhood had grown quiet again in a way that felt different from before, less like silence, born of fear, and more like the ordinary quiet of people simply living their lives. She looked at me across the yard, but there was no mockery left in her expression, nothing sharp enough to bother responding to. I did not gloat, and I did not need to say a single word to feel like the matter was finally settled. I simply looked past her toward the strip of ground behind her house, where the white decorative stone had been replaced with a plain metal access cover bearing an official county inspection seal. Vanessa believed that pipe would keep everything she had done buried forever, hidden beneath a few inches of gravel and a story about landscaping upgrades nobody would ever question. But water always leaves a trace, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide the line it travels through. Once I started following it, every lie she had built on top of that hidden connection flowed straight back to exactly where it had begun.